For 300 years, people have fought over a single word, whether Creole meant white or black, French or African, a bloodline or a culture. Families split over it, courts ruled on it, and the whole community got erased by the answer other people forced onto them. Everyone was sure they knew who the Louisiana Creoles really were, and then geneticists started reading the actual DNA of the people who carry the name today. What it showed didn't pick a side in the old argument. It dismantled the question the argument was built on. Let's be clear about where this is coming from, because identity arguments usually run on feeling, and this one finally has hard data underneath it. In 2015, the American Journal of Human Genetics published a landmark study led by the geneticist Katarzyna Brake, drawing on the DNA of more than 160,000 people across the United States through the company 23andMe. It remains one of the largest portraits of American ancestry ever assembled, and one of the things it let researchers do for the first time was zoom in state by state and watch how the country's population had actually mixed, not how people describe themselves, but what was written in their genomes. A few years earlier, in 2012, a separate team led by Laura Sucherston had published a study in the journal PLOS1 using a Louisiana and North Carolina research cohort. Buried in a project about disease risk was a quietly explosive finding. When they measured the genetic ancestry of African American participants in Louisiana, the people who identified specifically as Creole did not look genetically like the African Americans who claimed no particular ethnicity. Their ancestry was measurably, statistically different. Crucially, when researchers looked at African Americans who claimed no special ethnicity, the differences between regions faded away. But for the Creole identifying group, the distinction held firm. The label wasn't just a family story or a cultural badge. It tracked something real in the DNA. Put those two findings together, and you have something the centuries of arguing never had. A way to ask the genome directly. Who were the Louisiana Creoles? Not who did people want them to be. Who in the actual record carried inside living bodies were they? And Louisiana, it turned out, was a special case even among the 23andMe findings. The researchers were able to watch history surface in the genetics state by state, and the patterns lined up with real events. In Oklahoma, African Americans carried the most Native American ancestry of any state, a trace of the Trail of Tears, when indigenous nations and enslaved black people were pushed into the same territory. And Louisiana kept showing up as the great American crossroads, the place where the lines between populations were blurriest, because it had been a hub where French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and Native peoples met and mixed for the better part of 3 centuries. When you went looking for where America's neat racial categories broke down in the genome, the data kept pointing at the same place, Louisiana. To understand why the answer matters so much, you have to understand how vicious the fight over that word really was. The word itself is older than the United States, and it didn't start as a category of race at all. It comes down through the Spanish Criollo, from the Latin creare, meaning to create or to beget. In the colonial Americas, it meant something simple and bloodless, native-born, of this place rather than the old country. A Creole was someone born in the colony, as opposed to someone shipped in from Europe or Africa. In early Louisiana, that's exactly how it was used. French and Spanish colonists born on Louisiana soil called themselves Creoles to distinguish themselves from the newcomers still arriving by ship. But Louisiana was not a place where populations stayed in separate boxes. Under French and then Spanish rule, the colony developed something the rest of the American South did not: a 3-tier society with a large, recognized class of free people of color in the middle. In French, they were called les gens de couleur libre. By the 1720s, there were enough of them that the colony's slave code, the Code Noir, wrote their status into law. These were not enslaved people, and they were not white colonists. They occupied a genuine middle ground. Many owned property, many were formally educated, sometimes in Europe. They served in militias, ran businesses, held trades. In New Orleans, they became artisans, merchants, and professionals, and as a group, they grew wealthier and more secure than free black people almost anywhere else in the American South. They had their own social world, their own churches, their own carefully guarded place in the order of things. A large share of them traced back to relationships between European men and women of African and Native American descent, some formalized in a system called placage, in which a white man entered a recognized arrangement with a free woman of color, often providing property, financial support, and freedom or education for their children. And here it is essential to be honest. That world of mixing was not a romance. It grew out of a brutal imbalance of power. It included negotiated arrangements, yes, but it also included coercion and outright rape, the routine sexual exploitation of women who had little or no power to refuse. The mixed population of colonial Louisiana was born partly of choice and very largely of force, and any honest account has to hold both of those truths at once. By the early 19th century, black, white, and mixed-race people born in Louisiana all still used the word Creole to mark themselves as native, especially against the flood of Anglo-Americans arriving after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The Americans came with a harder, simpler idea of race, a world of just two boxes, white and black, with nothing permitted in between. To them, the entire elaborate three-caste society of Louisiana was an offense to be corrected. The word Creole, in that older Louisiana sense, meant a culture, a language, a Catholic faith, a cuisine, a way of being from this specific place. It did not yet mean a race. It marked where you were from and how you lived, not which side of a color line you stood on. That is the world the fight was about to destroy, and the destruction came from the collision between Louisiana's fluid old order and the rigid binary. The rest of the country was determined to impose on it. Here is the first thing the DNA overturns, and it cuts directly against the most aggressive claim in the whole debate. As the 19th century wore on, and especially after the Civil War, a faction of white Louisianans worked hard to seize the word Creole for themselves alone. Some prominent white intellectuals of the era insisted in print that a true Creole had not a single drop of African blood, that the name belonged exclusively to the white descendants of the French and Spanish founders. The claim wasn't a casual prejudice. It was a deliberate project to wall off an identity, to take a word that had always described a mixed, native-born people and launder it into a certificate of racial purity. The genome says that wall never existed. When the 23andMe researchers looked at Louisiana specifically, they found a state that had mixed across every supposed boundary. Around 12% of self-identified European Americans in Louisiana carried at least 1% African ancestry, one of the highest rates in the country, tied with South Carolina. Roughly 8% of white Louisianans carried at least 1% Native American ancestry. Louisiana, the researchers noted, had been a meeting point where different populations came together and mingled, and the genomes of its modern residents still carry that history written plainly inside them. The people who swore on their honor that no real Creole had any African ancestry were, in a great many cases, carrying that ancestry themselves and never knowing it. This is the quiet devastation of genetic data. It doesn't argue, it doesn't get offended, it just reports what is there. And what is there in Louisiana is exactly the cross-color line mixing that the purity faction spent a century denying. Think about the irony of it. Men stood up at lecterns and wrote in newspapers and family histories that their Creole lineage was pure French and Spanish stock, untouched, and used that claimed purity to look down on their darker neighbors and to police who could marry whom. And the whole time, in a large share of those same families, the African and Native American ancestry they were so loudly rejecting was sitting in their own cells, passed down from a colonial ancestor whose name had been quietly dropped from the family story. The boundary they were defending ran straight through their own bodies. The first answer the DNA gives to the old debate is blunt. Creole was never a white-only word, and the bloodline it was supposedly protecting was already mixed. To understand how a whole population's history gets sealed inside individual people this way, It helps to step back from the word ancestry and picture something more ordinary. Think of a city's cooking. Over generations, the dishes of New Orleans absorb French technique, West African ingredients and methods, Spanish seasoning, Native American foods like filet made from sassafras. Gumbo isn't French food with additions, and it isn't African food with additions. It is a genuinely new thing in which every source is still detectable if you know what you're tasting, but none of them sits in a separate bowl. You cannot unmix it back into its origins. It has become its own dish. DNA works the same way, except the recipe is locked in and can be read back out. When a person descends from several distinct ancestral populations, geneticists call the result admixture, the genetic version of that gumbo. Every chromosome a Creole person carries is a patchwork, stretches inherited from a French or Spanish ancestor sitting right beside stretches inherited from a West Central African one, beside stretches from a Native American one. Modern ancestry methods can scan that patchwork and estimate how much came from where, and they can even tell from the length of the inherited stretches roughly how many generations ago the mixing happened. Long pieces mean a recent ancestor. Short fragments mean the mixture is old and has been shuffled many times. So the genome doesn't just say that a Creole person is mixed, it carries a rough timestamp of when the French and the African and the native lines came together, and in Louisiana, those timestamps point straight back to the colonial era, exactly where the history says they should. The mixing happened generations ago and can never be reversed, but unlike a pot of gumbo, the genome keeps the receipt. That is why a study in 2012 could look at people who simply checked a box marked Creole and find that their DNA really did differ from their neighbors. The recipe was different, and the recipe was real. Now the deeper twist, and this is where the debate turned cruel. If the white purity faction tried to claim the word from above, the legal system soon crushed the Creoles of color from the other direction. After the Civil War, as Reconstruction collapsed, white Louisianans stripped away the in-between status that had set free people of color apart for over a century. The privileges, the recognition, the legal middle station, all of it was dismantled deliberately over a few decades. By the 1890s, no middle ground was left at all. The three-tier world flattened into two, a people who had been free, propertied, educated, and distinct for 150 years were told within a single lifetime that none of it counted, that they were now simply black, on the wrong side of a line they had never lived behind. And then American law went further than custom ever had, with the doctrine that became known as the one-drop rule, the idea that a single drop of African ancestry made a person legally and socially black, with no middle category permitted to exist. The case that sealed it into national law came out of this exact community. In 1892, a New Orleans Creole named Homer Plessy, a man of mostly European ancestry who could have passed unnoticed, deliberately boarded a whites-only rail car to challenge Louisiana's segregation law. He did it as a planned act of protest, organized by a committee of New Orleans Creoles of color who understood exactly what was at stake, that the new racial order was trying to legislate them out of existence. His case went to the Supreme Court, and in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld segregation and gave constitutional blessing to separate but equal. The decision didn't just legalize Jim Crow, it enshrined the one-drop logic, ruling that a man who was, by ancestry, mostly European, was nonetheless black in the eyes of the law. An entire tri-racial people with their own language and history and middle station were ordered into a single box and told the box was the whole truth of them. A community that had spent 150 years as something that American racial binary had no slot for was now legally declared not to exist as a separate thing at all. But the genome doesn't obey a courtroom. The one-drop rule was a legal fiction, a tool of power, and it had no purchase on the actual DNA. Inside the bodies of the people it reclassified, the three-way inheritance kept right on existing. European and African and Native American ancestry, woven together, generation after generation, exactly as it had been before any judge spoke. The 2012 study is, in a strange way, the rule's refutation. When researchers measured self-identified Creoles, they found a population still genetically distinct, still carrying a signature the law had tried to declare non-existent. You can erase a category on paper. You cannot erase it from a chromosome. The deeper answer the DNA gives is this: the one-drop rule didn't describe a reality. It tried and failed to overwrite one. Before we go further, if you want the real version of these histories, the documented one, not the comfortable one, and not the conspiracy one, subscribe. This channel exists to put the true story back in the hands of the people it belongs to. Now let's be just as honest about what the DNA does not say, because this is the part most videos skip, and skipping it is how good history turns into bad myth. First, there is no single Creole genome. The studies we're drawing on are real, but they have limits. The 2012 Louisiana research was built from a medical cohort assembled to study cancer, not from a careful census of the Creole community, and its numbers describe that specific group of participants, not every Creole everywhere. The 23andMe data is powerful precisely because it is huge, but it reports broad averages and the rate of people carrying a trace of this or that ancestry. It is not a tidy formula that says a Creole is some exact percentage of anything. Individual Creole families range enormously. As one community elder put it in a documentary on the subject, they run from dark brown to blue-eyed and blonde. The DNA reveals a pattern of three-way mixing, not a fixed ratio every person carries. Anyone who tells you a real Creole is precisely such and such percent African or European is selling certainty the science does not support. Second, the middle caste was not innocent of the system around it. The gens de couleur libre lived inside a slave society, and some of them owned enslaved people themselves. Their in-between status was real, and so was the fact that it was purchased, in part, by participating in the same brutal economy that had produced many of them. Honoring their history does not mean sanding off its hardest edges, and none of the complexity on the African and Creole side shifts the weight of responsibility off the system itself. The European colonists who built it, the laws that enforced it, and the white power structure that, after the war, deliberately destroyed the middle ground and imposed the one-drop regime. That is where the moral center of this story sits, and it does not move. Third, a word about the word itself, because the confusion is not over even now. Creole has never had one fixed meaning, and that is part of the point. To some it names a culture and a language, to others a specific Afro-French heritage, to others still the old white colonial families. Even the boundary with Cajun blurred over time, as impoverished white Creoles in the countryside intermarried with Acadian families until names that began as French Creole are now simply called Cajun. The genome can tell you about ancestry. It cannot by itself tell you what to call yourself. That is a question of culture, family, and choice, and the DNA was never going to answer it. What the science settles is narrower and stronger. It settles the lie that the mixing didn't happen. What survives every one of those caveats is the core finding, and it is sturdy. The Louisiana Creoles are a genuinely admixed, tri-racial people whose identity tracks something measurable in the genome. That much the DNA confirms. So let's bring it home. Because then under all the law and all the science, this was always about people being told who they were allowed to be. For most of the last century, the Louisiana Creole was caught in an impossible position, summed up in the title of a documentary about the community. Too white to be black, too black to be white, pushed out of the white category by one faction, folded into a single black category by the law, and through all of it insisting stubbornly on a word that named what they actually were. That insistence used to look to outsiders like vanity or denial, a refusal to accept a simple racial reality. The DNA reframes it completely. It wasn't denial, it was accuracy. The people holding on to the word Creole were describing their genome more honestly than the categories being forced on them, because the thing the science settles runs deeper than any percentage. The word Creole began by meaning native born and mixed of this place, made from everyone who met here. It was a word about belonging to Louisiana, not about belonging to a race. The The genome of the people who still carry the name says that original meaning was the true one all along. Their DNA is the three-tier colonial world made flesh: French and Spanish ancestry, West and Central African ancestry, Native American ancestry, braided together into something that is not a dilution of any of them and not a betrayal of any of them, but a new American people in its own right. The purity faction was wrong. The one-drop rule was wrong. The simple binary that American race thinking demands was wrong. And the much-mocked Creole, refusing for generations to fit the box, was the one who had it right. If you carry that heritage, this is what the data gives back to you. You are not a contradiction to be resolved or a confusion to be cleared up. You are the living record of a place that mixed when the rest of the country insisted on separation, and a name your ancestors defended through a century that tried to take it from both ends. Every time a census taker demanded a single box, every time a stranger asked, "What are you really?" every time the question came loaded with the assumption that there had to be one clean answer, the honest answer was the one the genome now confirms. All of it, at once, braided so tightly it cannot be pulled apart. The debate over what a Creole is was never really a debate about you. It was a debate about other people's need for clean categories. The DNA finally settled it by saying the thing the categories could never accommodate. You were always exactly what the word first meant.